Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, depending on the part of the country you might be in, or where you are in the world. Welcome to today's panel discussion called Breaking the Code, Navigating Gender, Sexuality, and Ethnocultural Identities in Public Safety Occupations. My name is Dr. Lucianne Kewen, although almost no one calls me that. I go by LA most of the time. I want to welcome you to today's very special discussion and our last virtual event of 2024. I know many of you join us regularly, and we hope you find this information useful. We'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the lands on which we are hosting today's event. SUBCERT, and of course myself, acknowledge the importance of the land we each reside upon. I do this, and I hope we do this, to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in honoring relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, I acknowledge and we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples that call this nation home. Please join us and join me in considering how we can each, in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And if you, in where you are, would like to leave a land acknowledgement in the chat, that would be perfectly fine and encouraged. So just before I get started in introducing the wonderful panelists we have for today, just a few housekeeping notes so that everyone's operating off the same page. Everyone here except the panelists and myself are in listen-only mode. We do that because otherwise there's a fair amount of feedback and that can be disruptive in the audio quality. We are recording today's session, and in fact, you'll find the recording of this session on our YouTube channels after the event. There's a question box that you can use to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be trying to take as many audience questions as we can after a few introductory remarks by our panelists and an initial round of questions. This event will be presented in English for the most part, and we have simultaneous captions or audio translation in French. And I just want to talk through, there's some links and instructions in the chat that will take you through how to use the translation if you would like. So today I'm pleased to introduce our panelists, as I explained to them before we started, I have a bit of a speech disability, so I don't always get name pronunciations correct. So I'm going to ask each of them to just introduce themselves and their affiliations. Maybe we could start with you, Jose Luis. Sorry, there, actually, I did it already.
And thank you very much, and not a problem at all. Thank you very much, Ellie, and I'm Dr. Jose Luis Couteau. I work at the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. I've been here for 20 years, and my specialty with serving Ontario Chiefs of Police is assisting them with media, government relations, communications, and then I put on my Superman costume and become an academic at other times, which I really love. I'm primarily an associate faculty at the Royal Roads University. And I also teach at a couple of other educational college and university here in Toronto as well. So thank you for having me. My specialty is really on the law enforcement side of the questions that we're asking, primarily with identity construction. So that's always fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Andréanne, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, LA. So my name is Alhan Engern. I was a PhD candidate at the time that we settled the panel. I am now officially a doctor, so I defended my
Yay!
PhD dissertation. Thank you very much. So I work full time at the Montreal Police Service. So we offer psychotherapy, preventative efforts in terms of police mental health. And so we do emotional debriefings as well as individual one-to-one clinical work. And my research has primarily focused on women in policing. So specifically with the role of gender and how that can impact the experience of women police officers.
You. Lynn, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. My name is Lynn Goliker. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. I'm also Métis from the Northwest Angle Treaty, Treaty number 3. That's Northwestern Ontario, for those of you who don't know. It's the only treaty in Canada that officially recognizes Métis people as treaty people. I'm also a 16-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. I survived the LGBT purge campaign. Once I left the military, I went on and got my doctoral degree, and I do and have been doing interdisciplinary types of research now for 30 some years. I work in collaboration with one of the panelists here, Dr. Carmen Poulin, and done a lot of work with her together. So what I've focused on, I'm a sociologist by traditional training. And so I've studied various institutions like the Canadian military, Canadian firefighting, Métis organizations, but most importantly, from the perspective of marginalized people within those organizations in some way. So i.e. women in the Canadian military, LGBTQIAS+ people in the Canadian military, their partners, women in firefighting, easterly located Métis or Eastern Métis peoples. Interested as well in a way about identity formation or identity, because I think organizations do have an influence on that as well. I will try not to speak too much, but I'll leave some room for my colleague to speak. But I just want to say, in terms of identification and this notion of identity, I think I've said why it's important for me to be here today. Some of the research we've done is on this first responder, i.e. like the firefighters. But in terms of my identity, I identify as woman, I identify as a lesbian, I identify as a Métis, I identify as Métis Two-Spirit, I identify as a veteran. So you can see from a positionality perspective, I come from those sort of interlocking areas as well. Thank you.
You. And lastly, but certainly not least, Carmen.
Thank you so much, LA. Thank you to the Canadian Institute for the Public Safety Research for organizing these things. I think they're wonderful. So my name is Carmen Poulin, and I am a baby of the Quiet Revolution. So that should situate you in terms of where I'm from. So I'm from Quebec, south of Montreal. And that actually is an important piece of who I am, because it shaped my experience very, very early on, living in the family of some people, a large family, some people who believed in separatism, and the other camp believed in not separatism. So that set up the stage for an interesting upbringing. So I've done research with Lynn Goliker for all of that time. So she's introduced many topics we've touched on. We also supervised a student that I'll just mention, especially for interest for LA, Dr. Frida Burdett now, who also did her PhD thesis on women in corrections. So I thought I'd mention this. And I think if I want to highlight a couple of particular areas that we've looked at quite a lot, I would repeat those that Lynn mentioned in terms of women firefighters and 2S LGBTQIA in the military. We have the most, or I feel like we have the most things to contribute, but also in terms of our own experience. So I was a partner of Lynn, actually. So we'll come out right away so we won't get stuck in the details. And that means that I lived with a military member. So partner's experience is also interesting in terms of a positionality when we think about the dynamics of marginalized groups, especially when those marginalized groups are not welcome in an institution, such as was the case during the purge. In terms of the military, explicitly with laws, but also in terms of just informal practices that go on every day in the way an organization functions and how it works around different questions, issues, situations, and whether or not it has official ideology written on paper or not. It has an ideology, it practices according to this ideology, and if you're on the margin, that's what your everyday life is made up. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation. I think it's fabulous undertaking. So thank you so much for whoever's responsible to put this together. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Thank you. Thank you for, I thought we'd maybe start by just talking through a little bit about some of the things you've already started to talk about. And why, I also want to situate that I think I'm a sociologist too by traditional training. And I always like to be a little reflexive about why this topic is important for me. And because also, I'm not going to come, everyone's going to come at it with their own kind of set of experiences and exposures. So just so people know, I started my career when I was 19 as a welder's apprentice in an all-male shop in the early 1980s. And you can imagine that was a unique experience and shaped my world a lot from the very beginning. And my mother was an active feminist, a second wave feminist when I was growing up. Then I came back and did my degrees in my late 30s, early 40s. Then I went and worked in corrections. And I worked in national headquarters and corrections, but much of my work was done in our maximum security institutions in Canada. And so you can imagine that I have some experiences and exposures there. So I'm not coming at this from with some unique exposures myself. And this is why this topic I think is so meaningful, is I think we need to understand, as Lynn was kind of laying out, that we're often have lots of positionality, lots of identities that work in different ways. And one of the terms that gets used a lot in this context is intersectionality. And that will be an important element, I think, that we're going to end up talking about here. So I wonder if I could ask Jose Luis to just kind of, and we'll go around here, talk about intersectionality and how you give an example or how you might define it.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I think even though this is a well understood topic from an academic perspective, even within the academy and certainly sort of outside, I think this is a contested term. So all of us are definitely coming at it from different perspectives, and what it means to all of us, it has different hues. But I think that fundamentally, I've always looked at intersectionality as interconnectedness of primarily around social categories, things like race and class and gender, that overlap one another. So the way I've always explained this to my students who have a really hard time to sort of understand the fundamental importance that I give to intersectionality is to think about layers of let's say a fruit or a vegetable, and as you peel back the layers, you see the actually complexity of what it means to have all of these different things that make you who you are. And I think in our world today, I think even though it's more complex world, with the technology and the bombardment of information overload, we think that we're so much that the highest achievement of Homo sapiens on planet Earth kind of thing. I think people still don't understand how complex humans are, and so we, I come at this from a very critical perspective, frankly. State actors that want people to be the same, whatever that means. That that homo kind of feeling. They don't like intersectionality because intersectionality challenges you at a very fundamental level to understand that what makes people tick at an individual level, and then at a social level, it's really about things like knowledge and power. And when you start seeing the things that either cocoon you and don't let you be who you are, particularly around emergency services, as we're talking about, this sort of this incredible need for what I call state actors to have us all be the same becomes overwhelming. So an example that I give my own example, frankly, I hope you don't mind, it's not an academic one here, but when I came to this country, my parents brought me here from Brazil. When I came to this country, very quickly being thrust into the education system, I presented myself with my name, Jose Luis Couto. That's my name. In fact, I have my mother's maiden name thrown in there just for fun, but that was my name on my passport. When I got to school, the very first thing that the administrators at the school did was say, no, Jose Luis, nobody will pronounce that. Nobody will know what that is. We don't know about hyphens on letters. Your name is now Joe. I had never heard of Joe. Who is Joe? But Joe became me. And so throughout my life, I was Joe until, frankly, I decided to, to pursue grad work when I realized that basically what they were doing is taking away the intersectionality of who I am. Yes, male, but also Latino, from a Portuguese-speaking country in a predominantly Spanish continent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I took that back, that created all kinds of problems. For instance, on passports and things of that nature, driver's licenses, and even people who know me, they suddenly became very discomforted. Do I now attempt to pronounce your name the way it should be? Why do you have to change your name? Are you just trying to be, different, et cetera, et cetera? So the intersectionality to me is very uncomfortable, and it should be uncomfortable. So if you're thinking about intersectionality and you're thinking, oh, this is just an academic exercise, it's not an academic exercise. It's about people, how they see themselves, and then fundamentally how they force other people within their professions to look at themselves and accept them for who they are, rather than trying to change it because it's easier. So, I'm dealing with that teacher, long gone, but I'm still dealing with the consequences of her doing that. But, intersectionality to me is everyday living, and that fundamentally is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea, do you want to go next? How would you reflect on intersectionality?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think that it's really interesting to sort of bounce off of what Jose Luis you mentioned, which is so rich. And you've talked about, the complexity of it and the layers, and in how I think about intersectionality, so the overlap of different identity factors. And I would really like to relate that to what was mentioned in terms of knowledge and power, because the intersectionality of identity will influence the knowledge, the experience, the lived experience of individuals, and also the power that they might be able to wield as well. So I think it's something that is so present in all of us, but also in all of our experiences, and how we sort of make sense of things. I will maybe talk about it with a more lens of mental health as well. And I think about when we think about the context of policing, and how people might come into a career in policing, and they might be prone to put aside facets of their identity. So it might be uncomfortable to connect with the fact that they are at different intersections, and there are a lot of different layers to who they are as people, and they might want to fit in a bit more with that sort of uniform, stereotypical police officer version. And so what we can see is that that can be detrimental to their mental health. So, for example, a woman who comes into policing and who will be more prone to put aside some of her identity as a woman. So maybe her ability to connect with her emotional world, she might be less prone to do that as she embarks on a career in policing, because she wants to maybe fit in more with the stereotypical aspect of what she thinks. And what I've seen through my research is that over time, and as people gain a bit more acceptance, they're maybe a bit more prone to connecting with the different facets of themselves. But I think maybe if I connected back to the example of Jose Luis, how we might, it takes courage and it takes strength to connect with those parts of ourselves. And so I think it's important to see a person as a whole, and with all the different layers that makes them who they are, and how those might be strengths, but how those might be sometimes difficult to be accepted by the environment that they're in. And so they might be prone to maybe put that aside. So this is maybe the vision that I would have on intersectionality.
Thank you. Lynn, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. I think, it sort of came to me possibly when I first got to know Carmen, and Carmen was a bit in academia before I was, and then we tried to work together, come together. Sociology and psychology is like, if you think of silos, are a bit different. So that was sort of what sort of started blowing, I guess, these walls apart, if you want to think, or maybe started this trajectory down towards this lane of intersectionality. Interdisciplinarity is maybe another close cousin as well. But I think if we think about intersectionality, and if we think of actually who we sometimes credit it with, Crenshaw, we look at it, it comes from the marginalized peoples themselves, and just them trying to voice, I'm here, recognize me, I have a little something different to say about the way the world's treating me. So I think intersectionality means, are embracing those different voices. And I think I've heard that a couple of times, these differences, and breaking and being open to listening to them. And also knowing a bit about, like, when I was younger, I didn't think about, I was too much involved in trying to make my way to the top of this military structure, very powerful one at that. So understanding relations of power when it comes to people, it can be really helpful. And then who's the dominant group within, whether it's an institution, and as you said, Andrea, the environment, how that can influence or disable certain groups or certain peoples from being active, or even realizing or attempting to realize who they can or want to be. And I think the ultimate thing for me is that if we can, on the one hand, for me, I'm a researcher in social change, or social activism has sort of come around to that point, is helping people understand that when we take these perspectives, these points of view into consideration, we're going to be changing things for the better, not just for one particular group, but for everybody. Those changes bring about positive change for even the dominant group in itself, whereas oftentimes they see, well, if I take into this group's perspective, it's going to be a loss, but I don't see it as necessarily a loss for the dominant group, if we want to use that terminology. I think it's a plus for everybody, including them. Thank you.
Lynn? Well, Carmen, how would you like to reflect on intersectionality?
Yeah, and it's a great question because as we can hear, we don't think about necessarily the same way or we don't go the same place, but I just finished one of my course, so I'm going to get onto my soapbox right now and give you a little lecture. And my lectures typically start with a little example, and I'll take you back to a moment when I was in France, and my parents-in-law were there. My mother-in-law was in a wheelchair, and she was old, as in what we consider old legally. So she could be getting a break on the cost of a train ride if she was old, and then she could get a different break if she was disabled. She was both of those things. And that intersection did not exist. She could not be actually registered on both of those things because there was one box, one unifying box. So for me, that's a good example because it's like, nobody else had voiced the problem with this. They were shocked that I would, because I think people tend to try to fit in. It's not a dominant experience. So, but I was buying the ticket for her. She probably would have been crawling under the carpet had she been able to, with embarrassment, because I drew attention to marginalized status as I was discussing this. But by the end of my arguing, I'm just going to give you the punchline. I had an audience and they clapped because I thought till I was going to get something arranged for her. So that's an example of intersectionality really doesn't fit. And as Jose Luis, do you use your Jose Luis?
Either way, that's fine. Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah.
Andriana and Lynn already mentioned, we try to, fit in and to figure out the power dynamics. And if you're in a place of marginality, and I live in New Brunswick right now, I should have said that earlier on, but I arrived several years ago from Quebec from a place of dominance in terms of my first language. And then I thought, oh, yay, I'll meet some Acadians and we'll be able to speak French and, we'll affirm our rights and everything else. And boy, did I fool myself, because they do not have the same culture and the same experience as I had as a Francophone. And so it totally, for the first while, I was totally disorganized. And so when we talk about the complexity of those experiences in terms of when they don't fit in the, I'm a woman, so there's a lot of us. It's a dominant group in terms of numbers. And I'm a Francophone. I came from a place where there was lots of Francophone, but all of a sudden, I'm a Quebecer, and that identity just didn't exist. And the way I behaved didn't have its place there. And so I could have continued acting and behaving like it, but that's a hard place. So what I want to draw our attention to think about is when you occupy those middle ground, just like my mother-in-law trying to crawl under the carpet when I was arguing, it's a place that's difficult to occupy. And it's a place that demands courage to sort of embody it and live with it, because there's a cost to it. So when Jose, you say, you changed back your name and you went back to Jose versus Joe, I've responded to my name. My name is actually Carmen Poulin. That's how I learned my name, but I don't hear my name ever in my everyday experience, only when I go back home in Quebec or in my family. No one can say it, but I haven't chosen to insist on it either, because I think we have to choose when we have the stamina to be a different, because we love to be the same. It's simpler. It doesn't create ruffle, and waves. So that's one thing I wanted to say, and I've got just a couple more with this idea of intersectionality. And oh, I should have said also at the beginning that I am the psychologist in this collaboration between Lynn and I. And yet, I always like to think about the psychology or the ideology of organizations. So when I use the first example, it was a computer program that reflected the ideology that we had. So it's every decision and practices that can make us feel really uncomfortable if we occupy that rare position. And the other thing, I will stop in just a second. The other thing that I find that is difficult is rarely do we have the opportunity to have another person in front of us reflect our own experience in a way on the basis of an experiential knowledge of what it's like. But that's something that's really important to do, I think, is to try to find those people once in a while to have that reality affirmed so that you can recharge in terms of occupying that intersectional space. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask each of you to kind of reflect on your own work and in this kind of where we sit as humans and how we interact with our organizations. And of course, the power aspect is really important when we talk about this. And what your own research finds. And I find this interesting because I distinctly remember that in the correctional space, I often tried to appear non-gendered, because that actually paved the way for it to be easier for me to interact in those spaces, especially when I was the only woman, which was often. And I remember distinctly one day walking in on a conversation and trying to fit in, and a particular person looked up, all of a sudden realized that I wasn't a man, and said, "Oh my God, you're a woman," and then completely changed the conversation. And that wasn't a unique experience. It was an expression that normally people aren't that upfront about, but you could see within that kind of all the dynamics that were happening, right? So, Andrea, maybe I'll start with you. If you could kind of talk a little about your work and what you kind of seen in this space in regards to the things we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I come in with sort of a double lens. So my research was primarily focused on how gender can relate to mental health and different areas of mental health in policing. And so in the beginning, I looked at a little bit more on what potentially could impact symptoms of mental disorders. So how gendered experiences, both for men and women and for individuals who don't identify as men and women, can relate to their mental health experience. If we think about policing, it's quite a gendered culture, and so that culture still impacts how individuals relate to their mental health, specifically with sort of opening up that things might be difficult. And there's a lot of expressions, and sometimes if I'm looking for my words, I'm translating maybe a little bit in my head, but there's a lot of expressions associated with experiencing vulnerability and experiencing emotions, sometimes just experiencing emotions, which would be totally normal after one's experienced a traumatic event or a stressful experience. And those expressions are associated with a lot of negative language. So it could seen as being weak or something breaking, having to put, I don't know if it's an expression that people have in English, but putting your knee down, meaning that you've had it. And So I think, especially when we think about intersectionality and different layers of identity, how that can be related to the language that people use with oneself and with others as well when they experience anything that might be related to the more emotional experience related to their work. And after that, I started to focus a bit more on the strengths. So when we think about mental health, we're often looking at symptoms focused research, which is super important. But I also thought about the strength aspect of it. And what is interesting and what we find is that when you connect with the emotion, that is often a, a, a good practice. So it's associated with not only positive change that might be actionable, so either seeking social support or seeking professional counseling, just being able to talk with friends or coworkers about their experiences. Um, so it is a positive practice to connect with one's emotion, but it's something that is implicitly learned quite earlier on in policing, that it's viewed as more negative. And so it's, if I think about it with a gender lens, which I did in my research, we see that women come into policing with good coping strategies. They're more prone to not repressing their emotion, and they're more prone to lean on their social support. But that's implicitly and sometimes explicitly learned that this is a negative practice culturally in the policing culture. And so they're might be more prone to putting aside those good coping strategies. And what's good is that when we focus on it as a strength, and when we maybe use preventative measure, psychoeducation, teaching on those things, and we reinforce those practices, then we can see that that can bring change at the cultural level. And I think we have to start with micro change. Changing the culture might be a bit of a hard experience, but just focusing on what can be the positive rather than maybe focusing on the symptom focus. I've seen through my research as well as through my clinical work that that can be something that is positive. So finding the strengths in individuals and being able to highlight those at the organizational level and at the cultural level, if it's reinforced by peers, colleagues, and the sort of in group, the majority group, then that can be something that is going to be more and more prone to happen and have positive impacts both for the individual and at the cultural level.
Yeah, so many important aspects. Thank you, Dan. Jose, do you want to go next? How have you seen, how's your work kind of worked around this, and in both your contexts, both the academic world and in the policing world?
You figured I'd learn how to unmute after all this time, right? Yeah. So you're right. There's a two-sided element to my work, but I've managed, I think, to some extent to combine them, because even though I work within law enforcement and work primarily in the province of Ontario with the senior leaders in this province, I've been able to through my doctoral work and some and other work that I have done academically to kind of marry the two. And primarily my research tends to be about construction of identity. To me, identity is fundamental, as Adrienne has spoken to how police officers as a group within a very particular profession see themselves, and therefore is reflected in their work. And that last piece is very important, because how they are reflected in their work has consequences for all of us who accept their work as public service. All right. When you call 911 and a police officer comes, they are coming to address probably something that is very wrong in your life. Somebody has broken into your house, somebody stole something, et cetera, et cetera. if they are bringing the kind of culture that builds police officers that traditionally has been focused on things like hypermasculinity. Traditionally, police officers have been heterosexual in their orientations. They've been traditionally drawn from the working class, and so you get the traditional police, how we do things based on those factors and many other factors. Even the female audiences of officers that I've experienced in my 20 years in policing, and I did a study, for instance, on gay female officers in the province of Ontario, and the fundamental conflict they have is this idea of, I need to bring myself to my work as a woman, a gay woman, a Black woman, for instance. But I have this culture that I have to also fit into, so that I have to be one of the boys. And I do use that as one of the boys, because it is, as Adrienne said, very overwhelmingly masculine, this profession. And so, when we look at those things, we see that certainly law enforcement, probably I would put in other professions like the military, firefighters, those types of professions. There is a struggle for the soul of these people. It is very much a struggle for the very being that they are. And so I always say, we are not teaching how to be police officers. We are building police officers, right? We can either build them as RoboCop warriors, or we can build them as guardians. And there's a huge debate right now. I've certainly saw this in my doctoral work, where police officers are torn. They want to be guardians. They want to be liked. They want to be respected, but they also want to kick in doors. They also want to drag people down. And do the traditional sort of tough guy stuff that we see in the movies, right? And you can see how this tears at a person's soul. Some of them become very comfortable saying, I'm going to be a rough and tough cop. I'm going to join the public order unit. I'm going to kick in doors, and that's what I'm going to do. Others leave the profession because they can't merge themselves and their professional selves. And so there's this duality. And I think all of us, anybody who struggles to have that sort of connectedness in all aspects of their lives, it's a horrible way to live when you don't feel yourself connected to who you are and what you do and who you are. And so I find that in my research, there's a lot of sometimes tears, frankly, that people just have a hard time even talking to an academic like the people on this call, and telling their stories, right? And I'm a journalist by trade. My undergrad was in journalism, and I love to hear people tell. And sometimes it's very difficult because they are literally ripping their soul and exposing it to you, and you have to be very, very sensitive to that. So just going back to the intersectionality here, and I think it's incredibly vital for us if we're going to have good public services, especially on the law enforcement and public safety side. We have to help the people who have committed their lives to bringing themselves their best to work. And we are fighting, and certainly in policing, and deeply ingrained and embedded culture that demands that we all be the same. And so how are we going to negotiate that? That is the $1 million question. If somebody wants to give me $1 million, by the way, to do research on that, I happily accept that. That'd be very nice, but nobody's done that. And that is the $1 million question. Thank you.
Thank you. Carmen, do you want to go next? What about your work? Or do you and Lynn want to talk about it together? How whatever way you want to do this.
I'll say a few things, and I don't know which, I'll talk about a little bit about female firefighters and a particular aspect of our work that we're just getting ready actually for publication. We did this work with Lina Mohammed, one of our honor students. And we looked at how women policed each other in terms of their behavior and their gendered behavior. And it's a really, really difficult experience when, for instance, you want to go and, not make a ripple, and somebody else decides to show vulnerability, whether or not it's to cry, whether or not it's to do something that brings out the issue of gender. And it reminds me of an experience I had when I was quite young and much more fiery than I am now, but raging feminist. And I had met an old-time lesbian, toughened up, and she said to me, she said, you feminists disrupt everything. You put things in the view of everybody, and then we have to live with the consequence of that. And we survived for all these years, and you people haven't a clue. So it's really hard, I find, when I think about all of these women that are working together in the firefighting world, for instance, to be able to support each other and feel like they can make changes in the culture. Because the reality is that they need allies, I think, because there's so few. By the way, there's very few women firefighters, and I should say that when we started to do this work, we had a big pan-Canadian study done already on lesbians in the military, but the whole alphabet. Actually, it was the LGBT alphabet at that time. That's how wide it was. It's since then stretched in terms of 2S LGBTQIA. But we thought we were going to encounter a world that was much more flexible, because it was in the civilian world. And we always think about the military as the toughest of them all. But because of how firefighting is legislated, namely based in communities, and it's the communities that establish their budget and that decide whether or not, it's very splintered across Canada, and most of our firefighting is a volunteer firefighting force. And so legislating rules and regulation, for instance, that, we need to have uniforms that fit everybody. If it's a small frame, then it has to be a uniform that fits a small frame, not 2 sizes too big, because that, is difficult. By the way, this is common practice, is to have to wear a uniform as firefighting gear that is too big. So just imagine wearing boots that are 2 sizes too big going up a ladder, what impact that has on your performance. Having gloves that are 3 times too big, and the cost associated with those gloves and those boots. And when the assumption is that you will only be there until you get pregnant. So those are all some of the things that women wear. But if you show that, right, even if you're pregnant, it is hard on other women. And so they police each other. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but this is a dynamic that we've looked into and analyzed. And I think it's one that there is no one to blame in this situation, because every player is at a loss for existing in that organization in a way that is accommodating, and whatever strength and force they have to exist with that, that intersectionality that they are living in. They're firefighters, but they're women, and those two things don't usually go together. And I think there's so many examples of how those things are difficult. Now, I just want to add something to that example that I've just used in terms of the boots. If you've got a small frame men as a firefighters, and we have those too, but our research shows that that's not the same challenge to buy a new outfit to fit that man. But for women, first of all, the outfits are not made to be practical in terms of fighting fires for hours on end, which is our reality now in Canada in the summer. So going to the washroom is very simple if you're a man, given the outfit that they have. in comparison to women. If we're fighting some kind of fire, if it's in the middle of winter at minus 30 degrees, if you have to go pee, it's a complicated undertaking for a woman. So that's a practice that embodies an ideology. And because it's little communities that have to pay outfits, and they're very expensive, like firefighting outfits are tremendously expensive. If you're a woman, it's going to be a different kind of challenge. So just some more example of how the dynamics of those environments is so multi-layered with challenges that keeps us from being willing, us as in anyone who lives intersectionality, to always have the strength to make that intersectionality visible so that it's easier for the next person. So there's all those contradictions going on at all time. And that's what I find has been one of the most amazing teaching or kind of like, showing us that milieu, the women that shared their experience. It was really remarkable. And I want to take this opportunity to really thank them, because they talked about some pretty difficult stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. So interesting. I keep thinking back through my own experiences as you were talking. Lynn, do you want to kind of take the floor now?
Yeah, maybe I'll try and just take it to a different spot as well, because we talk a lot, seem to talk a lot, understandably, about gender, and I still think gender is a huge marginalizing factor in the world today, and I do use that specifically and in general as well. I think it's huge, and our research shows, even at the smaller levels, that gendered element is just enormous. But I want to go back to this notion of sameness. Jose, you mentioned something about, we, on the one hand, some of these institutions, and I'll say paramilitary and military institutions, have this sort of ideology, and it's historical as well. History is always a problem for us to bring about change, because we can drag up history, and it's so easy to fall back in the rut of history and continue on from that spot. But we think everybody has to be the same to do the job well. There is an ideology of sameness, and I think institutions need to grapple with that themselves, is what I would say, and they haven't and they don't. In the military, firefighting, they're all under that. And that, if we have that ideology of sameness as the criteria for good work, it's not going to work. Because it doesn't evaluate people based on what they need to do for the job. The job is a job is a job. And so sameness becomes sort of a filler to criteria. So if you cannot look the same, if you cannot easily be invisible and be the same, then you're already on the outside. So that can be a tough, I just want to mention that in terms of marginality, that you have this notion where some people can sort of fit in, they can deny their identities that they have because they're invisible, and they can pass and get along or be the same. And so it's much easier. And I think, in effect, if we think about we talk a lot about health and identity and relate it back to that. But there's a lot of career implications, really significant career implications. And one of the examples that, in terms of our firefighting, but it comes out in various other areas as well, the military as well, is this tendency of people to be either kind of pushed, or they choose for various reasons because of their marginality to make career decisions. And so what happens is those people sort of get channeled into a different division that cannot change the institution either, because those aren't the people that move to the top easily. They, in fact, have become marginalized within the institution because of the positions. Like firefighting, if you go into doing inspections or into education, you no longer become perceived as being the person that can put out a fire. And I really want to highlight that word. Why do we use fighting? Why do we have to? Why don't we just use fire extinguishers? And I know it's a mechanical thing, but why do we have to highlight this word fighting all the time? anyway, just an observation when we start thinking about these various first responders and wearing of uniforms and what it means and the hierarchies and what that can do to various marginalized or this intersectionalities that people bring, and then how they can be channeled differently within those institutions. And this institution, it's so easy to say, everybody's got to be the same, because then I can just function with this one group of people, they all look the same, and I just have to have the same policy for everybody. And I don't have to get into all of the details that's under that. So I challenge the institutions, and the military is in hugely trying to play with that, because they're in detriment in terms of attracting employees. Their retention is down, attracting employees is down. So in terms of the military, we're kind of a disastered element in Canada. So how do we deal with that, or how is the military dealing with that? They're trying to deal with it in terms of, well, how do we keep people that aren't the same? How do we deal with that? I'm not saying they're dealing with it well, but they think they're dealing with it, and that's great. That's all you can ask, is some things, some people bring change, and we do have, and we do see the first CDS, Chief of Defense Staff in Canada for the first time in history. I'm not saying that she's going to be able to do much. We have walls around us as leaders, but it's the very first time that we see that. So it brings a different perspective, just having a person up there possibly. And that's back to that career implications. I think health implications are extremely important, because sometimes that's why they choose to go into these sidelines or these areas out of what would get them promoted up and changing the institution, is because they face less of the difficulties that they're facing in that traditional dominant masculinized role that calls on elements that aren't necessarily should be the defining role of that job. It just has been historically that way as well. So I'll just stop there, because this conversation can bring out so many different elements, and it's so fantastic to hear them.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you. I think it has brought out so many elements. So I want to make sure we have time to tackle some questions if they're there. And while people you'd like to put them up in the chat, that would be great, or in the question box, that would be great. While we're waiting for people to do that, I wonder if you could just take a minute or two each to reflect on where you think, in the management structure, in the power structures that exist within these public safety institutions and environments, whether or not you think they're taking into account and dealing with things such as intersectionality. Lynn, you kind of suggested maybe not, or maybe not well. Did you want to take a minute or two more to kind of reflect on that piece?
Well, our study in the military is much closer to being able to reflect on that, because they've introduced, like I said, the new Chief of Defense Staff is identifies as a woman and is there, and they have been reaching out, and I'll put that in quotation marks, allowing things to happen within their structure, because they always have, and they're very formal, and they allow and disallow certain things because they have a specialized act. They have their own set of laws that military people have to fall with under, and they can be charged and put in jail, military jail, just to emphasize it. So the military allows and can allow certain things or disallow certain things to happen. So the military has been opening up, I would say, quite a bit on that front, i.e. to allow people to be part of Facebook groups. There was a period in time where I couldn't go down and march in the LGBT pride parades. That only opened up since, maybe 2012, 2015. I can't remember when Trudeau and some of the top military brass actually marched in the pride parade in Toronto. So that's just an idea of sometimes how these institutions can start grappling with things. And while the military is specialized and it has very specific laws, I think all institutions have their own policies, so they can do the same thing as well. To be open to intersectionality is how can an institution demonstrate that they're actually open to it and not feel like it's a vulnerability? Because if they can, then they're showing like they're actually moving away from an old model, is what I would say, is this notion that you don't have to be that strong, tough, masculine, powerful person with no sign of weakness, and weakness being equal to everything that marginalized groups often represent. it just shows that you're open to considering different perspectives. And if organizations can demonstrate that in their policies, that can be one place that opens up, and be opening to feedback and positive criticism, not that just gratuitous criticism, but positive criticism. That takes courage from an institutional perspective, talking about courage.
Thank you. Jose, can you reflect on that? I mean, I suspect, again, you've got kind of two perspectives on this kind of idea of how this gets dealt with in that kind of policy management side of things.
Sure. And in law enforcement, we're all about policies. One of my favorite phrases in policing that I learned 20 years ago was the first thing somebody sat me down and says, you have to understand this: standard operating procedures, right? Yeah. So I'm sure in the military, same thing, right? You have these big binders, they're usually digital now, and they hand them to the recruits and say, this is your Bible, this is how you police, right? And so if we think that simply changing process, how we recruit, how we train, how we promote is going to solve the challenges that come with intersectionality and all of the things that involves, we are fooling ourselves. That's my view. Again, I'm pretty critical on these things. Part of the problem is it's a structure. It's a structural problem here. It's that, policing, like the military, I'm sure many other institutions, it's systemic. It's not a machine. It's a plant, basically. It's organic. And if we look at it that way, then that organism has many different branches, and you nurture that, rather than this concept that policing is a machine that we can change parts. So we're adding now parts, rainbow colored parts. Is that what we're doing to policing? And that's it. We fixed racism. Well, let me tell you, I was involved with the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, which was a huge challenge to policing in this country. And to the credit of many police organizations in this country, they decided to start calling it murder rather than an unfortunate incident and stuff like that. That had tremendous pushback from people like police unions, for instance, and even senior leaders, because it was offensive to them, right? We're not racists. We are public servants and stuff. Well, no, when you see a murder happen, you call it a murder, right? So in law enforcement, there's always a really challenging thing that has to happen is you have to keep pushing for change, and that has to be fundamental change. And in my own experience, the biggest challenge to change within the hierarchy of policing is the mid-management level, right? These are the people that run the day in, day out policing. They're the ones that make sure that the frontline officers are doing their jobs. They're also the ones that report up the chain. I find that senior police leaders, they understand, right, that EDI issues, for instance, are very important. You can't just say no, right? The politicians and the oversight bodies are going to demand to see that. The frontline coppers, I teach a lot of frontline coppers, right? A lot of them are young people who are very comfortable with the technology, and things like stupid racism is stupid to them. I can tell you that. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't bad apples, whatever, but most of them haven't not been brought up to this idea that group is just, they're criminals because they are of that color, that orientation, that whatever. So, but we still have this sort of mid-management rank that still hangs on to this past because it's about power, right? They control things. They don't let things go up. They don't let things go down. And so change becomes very, very difficult. But I do believe that there are more and more people in policing, in law enforcement, to understand that the future is inclusive. It has to be inclusive, or we're going to die. Like, people are going to die because of it. And so when you put it to them that way, it changes their mentality to say, I need to be part of the solution rather than ticking off a box. I went to an EDI course. Look at me. That doesn't work. And that's very challenging because that's the way it's supposed to work. I go to the course, I put it in my file, I get promoted, right? And because my mentor who's above me promotes me. right? And that can't be it. We have to promote people strategically to say we need more female police chiefs in this country. We need more Black officers who are leading platoons. You know, we need more gay people who aren't afraid to march in pride parades and say, I march here in my uniform because my uniform is part of who I am. I don't put my gayness off when I put on my uniform. Why would I take off my uniform when I'm being my true self? And that's really challenging for cops in this culture. So, but I believe the future is brighter today than it was 5-10 years ago.
Thank you. And it's so interesting because I see one of the questions that we have is on chain of command. So how does a marginalized person have a voice when a chain of command exists? And this person says, I feel like we don't have a voice until we're considered senior. And I would reflect that I've found that often too. But also this idea of how do we get people to pay attention further up, right? Are we talking just amongst people who already see this as an issue? Andrea, do you want to kind of tackle that a little bit? And have any reflections on that?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question, and I think you know, the word that came to me when when I was hearing everyone's opinion was, I think there is a need for humility first. I think humility in the fact that, of course, change can be uncomfortable when things have been working a certain way for a certain time, and it takes humility to see what progress needs to be made and how it needs to be made. And I think an important thing when in my interviews, so during the qualitative portion of my research, I think it's important that the change and the responsibility isn't led by the marginalized group. I think when we think about let's recruit more people who stem from different areas of diversity, that is a good practice, sure. But I think that also brings the pressure on these individuals to be the change. And so I think when I think about humility, it's sort of how at the organizational level, how can we think about ways where the climate of the workplace can be changed, in that the onus isn't on the person to bring about a change just by their presence, because that can be quite difficult already if you start working in an area where you are in the minority, and you might experience, first of all, the pressure of a new job, and not only that, but a pressure of a new job when you don't quite fit with the norms or the group, and then you also have to be a factor of change in the culture. That's a big ask of people. So I think it's important that the change comes from higher up. That is something that I think we can talk about in research, but now it's sort of how to do it at the policy level, and it's how to sort of support people at the individual level, but through policy change. And I think about it maybe more in terms of mental health, how we can give resources and access and care to people at the individual level through policy change. But I think that is something that comes to mind as an important factor. Sort of the change needs to come from higher up, and there's a lot more chance of positive change when it comes from there.
Thank you. And in fact, I think one of the questions that we have kind of reflects that idea that, you know, management and supervisors actually have a quite significant role to play here, because they kind of set that kind of context. Carmen, do you want to kind of reflect on any of this?
Yeah, and it's an important question, and we do research, and we have a big piece. We've developed this methodology, Lynn and I, over the years. We refer to it as the psychosocial ethnography of the commonplace. That's a mouthful. We just shorten it with PSEC method or methodology. And the idea is that we look at the everyday experience of marginalized people and look for complications. I don't think that we can tell the I mean, the problem is that it's true, once you're marginalized, you're not in a position, you're not at the decision-making table. However, you've got the experiential knowledge that is essential in order to know where the problem are. I mean, I'm not a left-hander, but I know the world is not built, it's built for me. I'm a right-handed person, so I don't care if there are scissors that don't work very well, or cups that don't work well, or tables that are put in the wrong side. I can only figure that out because I've talked to left-handed people. So I've had to, ask the people with the experiential knowledge. Otherwise, I can't figure that out. So yes, we need to have the people who have decision-making power in there getting their hands dirty, but not alone. And I think I would argue that you need the experiential knowledge around the table to guide where we need to go. And in terms of my responsibility as a researcher, and we've been at this for probably too long by now, but over 30 years, I take it seriously. When we find certain things that don't make sense, we try to act on it. So for instance, when we were working in 2S LGBTQIA problematic, or actually, and I have to situate it back to the LGBT crisis in terms of the policy and everything else. We finished the data, we collected the data, we understood the problem. We had some of it ourselves at that time because Lynn was still in the military, I was the partner, that wasn't the party. And then we got the numbers because we felt that if we wanted to convince those that were at the decision-making table, we needed to have numbers to say, this is what the reality is. And we didn't want to get into an argument about qualitative and quantitative methodology. We're both trained in both, but we needed the qualitative experience. So we had over 100 interviews with, 50 pages and so on and so forth, so that we could say, you can't shut us down. So we took great responsibility in having to do something with these results. And we worked for at least, oh gosh, I don't know. I want to say 5-7 years with that data, approaching government, making a network. It became known as We Demand an Apology Network, so that we would get the government to apologize. This was important for those people who had lived through the purge. This was a complication for their everyday life because some of them were so bruised and demolished through that experience. They needed some healing and they needed compensation. They had lost years of retirement, like a pension plan. I mean, you name it, lots of things had happened to those folks. But they were no longer able to be, all of them, at the decision-making table and put some pressure. But certainly we have a privileged spot. So I for one, take a lot of responsibility to make sure that those results will end up somewhere, that it's going to be at a table where they can make a difference. If that's how to design outfit for firefighters that fit women so that they don't have to suffer when they have their period and they can't change their pad or their tampons or whatever it is that they have to do after 8 hours of fighting fires in the woods or whatever. I need to think about that critically. So we've got a policy in our research that, we have a privileged position and we take the means to be convincing with our results. But we can't do it alone either. So we need the activists and the people with the experiential power, knowledge also behind us. And so my experience from what we've done and where we've been effective is if we've shown stamina, because it lasts a long time to bring about changes. It needs a lot of different people located in different places. And that's another thing. And you can't do it alone. And certainly I agree with you, Andrienne, when you say you can't put all the responsibility on the people with the experiential knowledge. That's not fair. And it's also not wise to put the decisions and the responsibility uniquely on the people who have the power, because they're missing out on understanding the situation. I think you need to start to think in, you know, interdisciplinary, intersectionality, inter everything, and have the team around the table to change things. Because I don't think we're going to change the culture overnight. I mean, and that's where the ideology rests, and takes form of different practices. But I take my role seriously. I think it's important we teach our students that if they're going to do something, like for instance, we have one of our PhD students is doing her PhD on climbing and the sports of climbing, which is a very masculine, upper class sport, and it's got a lot of practices that responds to a particular body, which is not one of a short woman. And so, you know, I said, well, what are you going to do? You're going to have to go all the way to the Olympic and change the rules here, you know? So I think it takes a community. Again, it's, you know, we always come back to this, with the right knowledge and the right power to work together. That, I think, is how we have to do it. And so we have to get up early.
Well, thank you. And I think that really reflects a comment that's in the chat about that, you know, we've made strides sometimes in some areas, but not all groups that identify in particular ways have made those same, you know, are in those same places. You know, in this particular person was talking about transgender and gender fluid. Like, you know, they're maybe even earlier on in the process of even having that recognized than some of the, you know, the identities we talked about here. And I think that's an interesting reflection. So we've just got a few minutes left. And so I'd like to give you the opportunity, if you have a concluding thought. If you'd like to have people walk away with one message or one question to think about, what that might be. Adrienne, do you want to, John, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to kind of start this round.
Yeah, if I think about something that sort of, if I'm hearing what everyone is bringing to the table, and I think it's been so rich to sort of discuss with all of the panelists and hear the point of views, and as well as the questions. I think I really liked, Carmen, when you talked about the fact that, of course, we need the people with the experiential knowledge, and sort of let's sit at the same table a bit more often. And, you know, we're here talking about public safety personnel, and that is already quite a diverse group with a lot of different lived experiences. So I think I'm left with the thought of, it would be interesting to sit at each other's tables a bit more often. And whether that's people with different lived experiences, or people coming from different groups, people coming from different also positions of power in bringing about policy change, of bringing in a table that's a bit more diverse and a bit more well-rounded. Often what I think happens is that the same people sit together at lunchtime every day. We'll sort of picture it like that. And we end up having great conversations, but they don't leave the table. So I think if we sit at each other's tables, maybe there's a bit more room for learning and for maybe bringing about change. So that's sort of the thought that I'm left with.
Thank you. That's an awesome idea. Lynn, what would you kind of have as a final parting thought here?
We do primarily qualitative research, almost exclusively, and the numbers of people that we've talked to over the years is quite large. The first study, 126, and firefighters, it was over 100. And The 2S LGBTQI presently is in the close to 50 right now, sitting at 50. So is the Métis identity 50. And I just want to extend, I don't know, I don't want to say a thank you to them because doesn't describe exactly my gratitude to them. But they are the ones that bring their stories, and we're talking about their stories with respect to the institutions, because we are interested in certain institutions, and that's the ones they're associated with. And I just want to say that what I've noticed with some of the people that we've been talking to or talked to, that just telling us their story is also a boost for them. I've known in our previous study, but that's one of the older ones, they've gone on to be activists in their own way, in their own right. So I think as a researcher, I don't want to take the credit for that because I still thank them for sharing that. But I'm hoping that in some small way that having heard their story then help them move to the next step and the next step and the next step, and that they're a vital part of these steps along the way. So I think there's the ones that I owe the most to as well in terms of doing this research, trying to elevate their voices in different ways, but also respecting enormously what they have put and given to myself and Carmen as well on this voyage. It is a voyage of trying to bring about a better world that we can all live within. And I still stand by that a change for any marginalized group is a change for the betterment of everybody, not just one particular group. It talks about the diversification and the need for us to do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I think there's something to be said about the power of just being heard. That sometimes that's a powerful thing for the individual. Jose, do you want to kind of weigh in with the last thought?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. We could go on for a few more hours, and I get the.
I think we could.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say what a pleasure it's been to hear from these academics, and great questions as well. A lot of things to actually think about. But I want to go back to something Lynn just said in terms of stories. It's so vital to give people the sense that they are being heard. And so many of my students who come from groups that have traditionally been oppressed, frankly, in law enforcement, and some of them want to be cops, which is amazing, which is great. I think the thing that I get from my students in that fit that description is they are so grateful that somebody listens to them and their stories and where they've come from and where their parents came from and what they have experienced. And more than that, I think it's about the hope that a lot of these students bring. And that's just on my academic side, but even in the day-to-day interactions I have with police officers in the province of Ontario, yes, there's a lot of resistance, frankly, to fundamental change to policing, particularly when it comes to including everyone in. And I really want to give a shout out to the person who brought up the issues around trans people, for instance, right?
Mhm.
Because we don't talk enough and we don't give enough voice to them, and they're still not represented in policing by and large. But I think there are people who are ready to be brave to say, I will be a change agent. At all levels of the policing hierarchy. Unfortunately, the thing about hierarchies is that it drives normative ways of thinking and learning and things like that. So in a way, I think we need to fight the natural urges of hierarchical institutions. And by the way, I would include that universities and colleges in that too.
Yes.
We're not saying that we're great here either, eh? So, but I think we need to encourage those people who want to be brave, particularly those who are in policing, in the fire services, in paramedic services, in the military, those types of service-oriented professions that may be struggling with their culture at the end of it all. And I think by doing that and being intentional, frankly, we need to promote more, Black females into senior managements. Every time we do here in Ontario, it seems that they get knocked back for one reason or another. And that's just the reality of it. But you don't give up because the whole thing about intersectionality, when people realize how powerful it can be to say, I'm bringing my whole self, I'm not bringing my blackness, the fact that I'm Asian, the fact that I'm gay, and I'm going to leave it at home and I'll put it on later. Doesn't happen, right? So when people tell their stories, when they feel empowered, when they think they have allies and people who love them enough to be their allies, then powerful change can happen. It's all based on hope, but also action, because this is about knowledge and power. I keep coming back to it. We need to have fundamental change, and not just as good as they are, things like programs and courses, apologies, they're great, wonderful, but if it doesn't change stuff, they're just words. Thank you.
Well, Carmen, I'll let you kind of take the last word.
Oh boy, it's an honor. So I just want to echo the sentiment that it was really an interesting and an important conversation, and thank you everyone for your contribution. And I think I just have 2 points that I thought I would leave people behind. I think we need to sell differences and explain how we can be a better place. And the world is a really complex place, increasingly so. And I think if we have many different identities and understanding of the world to work towards solution, that's going to work much better than if we have one way, it's my way or the highway kind of approach. I'm sorry. And I think my example of that, I'm going to go back to my data, to our data in terms of firefighting. Sometimes you need a big, bulky hunk to carry somebody out of a building, and sometimes you need a really tiny, powerful person to crawl under in a really small place to get somebody out of there and to open a door for other people to help. And it's really important to have a diverse group of a diverse army, I'll say it this way, in a not army in terms of necessarily the military, but a group of people that have different skills, different way. And oftentimes that comes with those master identities, because we develop different strengths based on where we come from. And the second thing I want to say is, in teaching now, we are invited more and more to develop universal designs. And so universal designs to eliminate barriers so that everybody don't have to, you don't have to have a world concentrating on, well, this has to be equal or this has to be equitable. Try to focus on removing barriers instead of trying to fix the barriers so that it can fit everybody. And I think we can try to do this in all sorts of situations. That's what I'd like for people, for all of the creative people that are listening today, and everyone to think, how can we remove barriers for differences so different people can all contribute to the world? Thanks.
Well, thanks to all of you, to all the 4 of you. This has been a really, I'm going to say for sure, the best part of my day so far, to actually spend some time thinking about these issues and talking about them, and thank you for your perspectives. And also the work that you're doing. It's so important to those who work in these communities or in these kind of situations of public safety. And of course, I think we all recognize that these are things that get manifest sometimes in mental health. And so I appreciate your coming and spending this time with us today, and for our participants, our audience, for sticking with us and for raising some really great questions and reflections, and for the work that they do every day if they're in these public safety occupations. I'm going to shamelessly end with a plug for our CIPSERT conference, which is happening. It's the first one that's happening in Regina in May. We're hoping to bring together a unique group, mostly for people working on front lines and PSP leaders, but also researchers into a conversation on topics like these ones, to try and get that conversation going and keep it going as we move forward in looking at health and well-being in public safety sectors. Thank you once again to all of you and to all our participants. We hope that this was valuable. You found this a valuable conversation. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank you very much.